and welcome to the latest edition of the Street Fighter Universe documentary. I'm delighted to be joined today by the one and only Gerald Rivers, who voiced the role of General Bison in Street Fighter V. I suppose, Gerald, a renowned sort of voiceover actor you are in terms of many sorts of productions. In terms of Street Fighter, how did that opportunity come about for you?
That's an interesting story. I'm an actor and I work in voiceover, but I also live in LA and have lots of friends who are in the business and lots of musician friends. I play drums and percussion and djembes and congas. But a good friend of mine, his name is Josh Phillips, and he's a rock and roll musician. He was staying with me. I think he was fighting with his girlfriend and his car was broken, kind of the classic lead guitar rock story. And
Yeah,
he was sleeping on my couch and he had an audition. And I took him to his audition because his car was down. And I went in and I sat in the lobby and I was on my telephone inappropriately. And the casting director came out of the back and said, "Excuse me, sir, are you a voiceover actor?" And in LA as an actor, you always go, "Yes." And I was, but
yeah,
it's like, "But of course." And he said,
yeah.
"Would you mind reading something for me?" And I was like, "Sure." So I went in, and that's how I booked M Bison in Street Fighter. The guy's name is Jonathan Klein, runs a company called New Generation Pictures, and he's been connected with the Street Fighter franchise for many, many years, long
Yeah.
before I even knew him, because he was interested in the graphic novels and he learned to speak Japanese and was going back and forth and has a few folks from there on his team here. And I didn't even know what I was walking into. I had played the game as a kid, some growing up, but I
Yeah,
can't say that I was a fanatic. But when it was very popular, everybody was playing it.
yeah,
And I don't think I ever played with Bison. I liked Honda and some of the other folks. And back then, there wasn't as much of the story and like the backstory that you would get. You just jump in and play. So it was fascinating to me to be a part of the franchise and to be accepted by what was already a large fan base and
mm,
people who followed it. And of course, I followed in the footsteps of several both Asian and American actors who played in Bison. But the word was out and the fan support was there. And so I've been revoicing it now for over 10 years.
and you mentioned that, Gerald, you're voicing the role of General Bison, and there's sort of very few sort of actors and voiceover actors as well have performed that role. And your name sits there with the sort of great Raul Julie, who played Bison in Street Fighter: Lord Mercy, and in that sort of be associated in those sort of lines, have your name right beside Raul Julie, and in terms of sort of elite sort of few names. So does that bring you a great sense of joy?
I'm honored to tell you the truth, because who knew? And I think the biggest honor came when Disney decided to do Wreck It Ralph, and
Mm,
they wanted to put M Bison in the film. And I have sort of a sorted relationship with Disney because they'll call me and they'll hire me, and then I don't hear from them, and so they had me auditioning for another series, a cartoon series, and I'd gone back and forth several times, and I met the producers, and they didn't offer me this series role. And then when they
mm,
called about this project, I told my agents, like, "Why are they calling me again? They've already seen me. They know what I can do. They've had me." And they were like, "Gerald, they're not calling you to ask you to reread for that thing. They're calling to ask you to do, and they're calling to offer you a job." And I was like, "Oh, okay, what's the
yeah,
job?" And What I was told was the engineers and the technicians who were working on the film, when they decided that M Bison should be a part of it, they said, we don't want to get somebody to sound like him. We don't want to get somebody to play him. We want the guy. We want the guy who we've been listening to his voice as they were growing up. And so that's been a great honor. And it's been associated with the franchise then branched out, and it was Street Fighter versus Tekken and Street Fighter versus Capcom, and M
Mm.
Bison has had a role in all of those. So it, as an actor, you're always grateful to be working, but to do something that fun and a franchise that large, it's just been an honor.
Yeah, and you mentioned in terms of Street Fighter and the backstories and the storyline, and obviously some of those storylines, those cutscenes, if you put them all together, they're like motion pictures these days. In terms of you watch them on YouTube, if you went in and saw, if you never were involved in a fighting game or weren't a big fan of the actual fighting itself, in terms of button bashing, if you just watched it as a standalone pictures, some of those cutscenes when they're meshed together, it really does stand up really, and in terms of cinema viewing and sort of so intrigue, it's sort of mini movies, sort of put into a sort of a fighting game these days.
Yeah, and for most of us now, we get to record those backstories. And so a lot of
Mm,
people playing the games don't actually, not everybody, but not everybody watches all of those sort of background stories and what were they doing and what happened in between, because there's a story that exists that's a through line the whole time, and we just sort of
mm,
jump in at different places in the timeline and tell the story of what our characters are doing there. But it's actually more fun, and it's been more exciting and more challenging work to tell M Bison's story versus
mm,
just having him, use his psycho power and crushing and all of the demeaning words he uses towards his opponent. There is more to M Bison than just that. It's interesting when they did the film for Wreck It Ralph, and M Bison is just in it for a split second, for a snippet in the first one, and he shows up in the second one and he just sort of walks by. But the folks on the red carpet then were asking, what is a world dictator bound and set on world domination doing in a kids film? I mean, as actors, we try to bring multifacets to a particular character. So for
mm,
me, he's not just an angry dictator set on world domination. Something happened to him, something happened
mm,
for him, something happened with him that brought him to the place where he is. And when you see those films with Raul Julia, and it's been played by at least one or two other actors, you get a sense of there's just more to it than meets the eye. The fighting game just shows sort of the end result, and now he's in the tournament and he's fighting, but they all have more of a story than that, and that helps us as actors when they are fighting bring other things to it. There's
mm.
more stuff underneath it than just the fighting game, so we like that. We like the storylines that get explored.
And I suppose, George, you mentioned there about Street Fighter and the movie itself. And back in the 90s, obviously the two big rivals were Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat. Tekken came along a bit later then. But where sort of Mortal Kombat succeeded breaking into the cinematic sort of world, its 1995 movie was a smash hit, the original Mortal Kombat, and it led to TV series Mortal Kombat Conquest, Mortal Kombat Legacy, and so like the Street Fighter Capcom sort of went against its rival, its big sort of rival at the time. It had the movie. It received mixed ratings. Obviously, it sort of pushed Capcom off making a sort of future movie in terms of that as well. So why do you think maybe Street Fighter and Tekken have failed making the crossover in terms of the big movie screen, where the likes of Mortal Kombat have succeeded? And as we know, Mortal Kombat has a new movie coming out again now in January 2021 to great sort of reviews and rave sort of anticipation. Where Street Fighter, they they tried it once, Capcom, and it sort of scared them in terms of doing it again.
You know what I think? I think games and stories like Street Fighter set the groundwork for Mortal Kombat because before that, the Street Fighter was they were angry and they were violent. It was interesting combat scenes, but Mortal Kombat came along at a time where I think in order to compete, it had to move it to another level. So they
Mm,
became so much more graphically violent. And I played a character in one of the Mortal Kombat games as well. One of the as part of that series as Jackson Briggs for a little while. But the
okay.
idea there were characters now that could reach in and snatch out the spine of another character or reach into his heart and hold a pumping heart in the game action that was
Mm,
so much more graphic and
mm,
violent than the sort of smooth, stylized fightings of even Tekken or Street Fighter that I think that built an audience base
mm,
that followed them into the cinema. Whereas by that time, the Street Fighter, the technology moved forward, but it was never as graphic as Mortal Kombat. Like just
mm,
jumped the gun and got way out there. Uh, Finish him and the crusher and the
mm.
I think that drew in a whole new audience,
Yeah,
and that audience followed them to the cinema. Whereas the Street Fighter fans, and I've learned this from going to some of the cons, um,
yeah.
they're a little older and they're a little more sort of true fans of the early story and not just of the graphic violence. But that graphic violence easily translated to get that audience base to follow them to the big screen.
Mm. And
Yeah,
Gerald, a sort of an interesting sort of response there, and a sort of it follows up my next question in terms of, do you think with sort of Netflix out now and all the sort of web sort of series and Amazon Primes and all that, do you think there is a possibility? It's been a long time since the Street Fighter movie came out, and I suppose we've gone towards the sort of cinematic sort of viewing now, where it's all sort of Dark Knight, Joker, all those sort of themes are more popular. The 90s was very PG, sort of campish in terms of the restrictions of what was allowed back then or acceptable. Do you think maybe there's an opportunity now for Street Fighter to relaunch itself, maybe in terms of a Netflix series and sort of from Capcom and go that route? Because it's been a long time since the last sort of movie. Obviously, do you think there will be an audience for something like that? And obviously, the way it is now with Dark Knight and Joker, they can be a bit more bolder in what they can do.
one, I would hope so, and I think so, and here's why. When you go to those cons and you see the folks who come out for, and they're of all ages, who come
Mm,
out Street Fighter fans, I think when Hollywood realizes that there is an audience out there that would support such a thing, that they would follow. And um, I hate to say this, being an actor, but
mm,
Hollywood sometimes lacks a little imagination, and
mm,
sometimes going back to pick up on something that there's already a fan base for is smart movie making. The idea
mm,
that there are folks of all ages who would say, "Oh my goodness, there hasn't been a Street Fighter movie in over 20 years. How about that?" I think there would be an audience for it, particularly with all of the Marvel and Capcom and all of the sort of video game and
mm,
even Wreck It Ralph. The idea of bringing things not just from the big screen to the video game, but from the video game back to the big screen. I'm certain there would be an audience for it, and people who could appreciate the story and the
mm.
storyline of the different characters who are all present and who all have more of a story than most people even realize.
And I suppose, Gerald, you mentioned there being a voiceover actor as long as well as an actor, and in terms of being involved in the video game world, where you're voicing an iconic character as Bison. We always know in terms of Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, they're almost like the FIFAs in terms of sport, or the Maddens or the NBA. You just know, come 2 years down the road, there's going to be another one, or a year there's going to be a pining, or an updated sort of version. And I suppose, in terms of that, I was speaking to other voiceover actors like Paul Dobson and Michael Dobson as well, and they spoke to me. And in terms of you're not sort of limited to one character portrayal being a voiceover actor. That you could be, say, Bison in Street Fighter V, and then you could be sort of Blanca in the next one, or Ryu in the one after that, whatever sort of comes about. While if you're involved in a TV series or a TV movie, you're almost tied to the one character. You can't really go back and sort of play anyone else.
The huge advantage and draw of being a voiceover actor is you can go to the grocery store and nobody knows who you are. I've gone
Mm,
into video game arcades and stood next to a Street Fighter video game that adults or kids are in there playing, and I could say something in the voice of M Bison right next to them, and they would look around, but they would have no idea that that was actually coming from me. For me, with Street Fighter, I've never done any other characters other than M
mm,
Bison in that game. I know there are some actors who can bounce around in the same game, but for me, it's been such a joy and so much
mm,
pride being associated with that one character. Now, of course, I do a bunch of other games and that Final Fantasy series, and we talked about Mortal Kombat, and there's a whole StarCraft. There's a host of others where I get to play interesting and wonderful characters, but and mostly bad guys because they're just more fun to play. And
mm,
even in the world of anime, there are series that pop up there that, as a voiceover actor, you get a chance to play, and new things come up like Trails of Cold Steel, and you already have a reputation, so those folks call you in. And there's a new one out now that I don't think I get to talk about yet, but
mm,
a revamping of an old video game, and it's the new version, and I play a different and another sort of mean bad guy, which I love that part. I'm really very nice, very chill, very mellow, so that allows a part of my personality to come out where there's no other place for it to be other than in the booth
mm.
where it's safe and it's animated.
And I suppose, Gerald, my final sort of question now to round you off before I let you go on. Probably probably most hardest question I'm going to ask you. In terms of, let's say there was a Street Fighter dictionary, an encyclopedia, and they put your character Mount Bison in the dictionary, and they left two blank sentences underneath it, and they asked you, having portrayed Mount Bison, in terms of your portrayal of Mount Bison, what would you, if you were to write those two sentences, what would you like those two sentences to read to sum him up?
One would say, set on world domination, but
Hmm.
you don't know the whole story.
Okay,
And I would just leave it at that. Set on
leave
world,
it at that.
but you don't know the whole story.
Uh, on that note, Gerald Rivers, an absolute pleasure to talk to you today, to relive your memories of your, obviously, it's still ongoing, your ongoing journey of Mount Bison in the Street Fighter universe. And obviously, more chapters yet to be told. And obviously, when this pandemic is over, we'll get to see many more incarnations of Street Fighter, and hopefully with you front and center. Gerald Rivers, an absolute pleasure, and take care.
The pleasure's mine. Thank you. And big shout out to Jonathan Klein and the folks at New Generation Pictures who keep bringing this stuff to the American public.
Cheers. Take care.